Hello everyone! Welcome to Untold History, the channel where we explore the most significant and often unknown events that have shaped our world. Today we enter a crucial chapter in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the First Intifada, a Palestinian popular uprising that began in 1987 and continued until 1993. This event marked a turning point in the struggle between Palestine for self-determination and Israel, as well as in the international perception of the conflict. Through mass protests, riots, and civil disobedience, Palestinians sought to challenge Israeli control in the occupied territories and reclaim their right to independence. Following the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were displaced from their homes and became refugees. Conflict did not end there, and in 1967, during the Six-Day War, Israel occupied the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, territories that had been under the control of Jordan and Egypt since 1948. From that year onwards, Israel implemented a series of control measures in the occupied territories, which became a constant source of tension, as Palestinians lived under Israeli military law and faced difficult economic conditions. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Palestinians also saw the number of Israeli settlers in the West Bank and Gaza increase, which was perceived as a direct threat to their aspirations for an independent state. Economic relations between Israel and the occupied territories were also strained, as many Palestinians depended on jobs in Israel but often faced discrimination and labor restrictions. In addition, the rise of organizations such as the Palestine Liberation Organization (PLO), led by Yasser Arafat, and its armed struggle against Israel from exile, fostered nationalist sentiment in the occupied territories. The First Intifada began on December 9, 1987, in the Jabalia refugee camp in the Gaza Strip, after an Israeli truck crashed into a group of Palestinian workers, killing 4 people. Although the exact circumstances of the crash were unclear, many Palestinians interpreted the incident as a deliberate act by Israeli forces. News of the deaths spread quickly and sparked a wave of protests in Gaza, which later spread to the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The First Intifada was a popular and largely spontaneous uprising, characterized by mass protests, riots, general strikes, and the use of stones and Molotov cocktails by Palestinian youths against Israeli troops. The Israeli response to the uprising was harsh and swift. Then Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin implemented a heavy-handed policy, which included the use of military force, prolonged curfews, and mass arrests of protesters. Israeli troops were ordered to suppress the protests, and the resulting violence left thousands injured and dead. According to reports from human rights organizations, more than 1,000 Palestinians were killed during the Intifada. In addition to violent repression, Israel used other tactics to try to quell the uprising. Housing demolitions were carried out as collective punishment for the families of those suspected of participating in the protests. Economic restrictions also increased, and many Palestinians lost their jobs due to Israeli security policies that limited access to workplaces in Israel. Despite the brutality of the repression, the First Intifada did not weaken. Instead, the uprising continued for years, with the participation of a broad sector of Palestinian society. As the Intifada progressed, new actors also emerged within the Palestinian political scene. In 1988, the Islamist group Hamas was founded, an organization that opposed both Israel and the PLO. Hamas, which quickly gained influence in Gaza, promoted a strategy of armed resistance against Israel and rejected political negotiations. This contrasted with the PLO, which began to lean towards a more diplomatic approach, seeking international recognition and support for the creation of a Palestinian state. In this period was the Algiers Declaration in 1988, in which the PLO, under the leadership of Arafat, proclaimed the State of Palestine and recognized UN Resolution 242, which called for Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories in exchange for peace. This was seen as a significant shift in the position of the PLO, which now implicitly accepted the existence of the State of Israel, paving the way for future negotiations. One of the highlights of the First Intifada was its media impact. Unlike previous conflicts, the Intifada took place at a time when the international media had access to footage of the clashes in near real time. The images of Palestinian youths confronting Israeli soldiers resonated deeply with world public opinion, leading to increased pressure on the Israeli government to negotiate a solution to the conflict. The Intifada finally began to subside in intensity in 1991, when the Gulf War changed the political focus in the region. However, the events of the Intifada led directly to the opening of a peace process. In 1993, after years of secret contacts between Israel and the PLO, the Oslo Accords were signed, which were negotiated in large part due to international pressure and the recognition that the status quo in the occupied territories was unsustainable. The Oslo Accords, signed in Washington, D.C., on September 13, 1993, marked the official end of the First Intifada. These agreements created a framework for the creation of a Palestinian Authority and established a process for future negotiations on the final status of the occupied territories. Although the Oslo Accords were greeted with hope by many, they also drew criticism from extremists on both sides, and their implementation proved extremely difficult in the years that followed. The First Intifada not only changed the dynamics of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but also transformed the way the international community perceived the Palestinian struggle. Palestinians were no longer seen only as refugees or victims, but as a people capable of mobilizing massively in search of self-determination. Internally, the Intifada marked a new phase in the development of Palestinian identity. Although internal tensions between groups such as the PLO and Hamas remained, the Intifada was a moment of unity in Palestinian society, where different factions, genders, and generations worked together to challenge the occupation. However, it also left deep wounds, and the violence and repression of this period continued to shape Israeli-Palestinian relations in the years that followed. The First Intifada left a lasting legacy in the conflict. Although the Oslo Accords generated hope, the lack of concrete progress in the peace negotiations led to a new wave of violence with the Second Intifada in 2000, a much more violent and prolonged uprising than the First Intifada. Palestinians' frustrations with the lack of progress in their struggle for a state of their own, coupled with the continued expansion of Israeli settlements, laid the groundwork for a conflict that remains unresolved to this day. Thank you for joining us in this analysis of the First Intifada. If you liked the episode, don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell for more revealing stories in untold history. See you in the next one.